"Don't touch me." The words came out low and raw, barely above a whisper, but Clara Whitfield heard every syllable of the pain behind them as she pressed her hands against the bleeding gash across the unconscious cowboy's side, refusing to pull back, refusing to leave him dying alone in the frozen dark beside that creek, while everyone else had already turned away. If this story of a man who learned to stop hiding and a woman brave enough to reach him moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The winter of 1877 came to Wyoming Territory with no apology and no warning. It arrived the same way hardship always arrived in Black Hollow, quietly at first, then all at once, swallowing the land in white until the mountains disappeared and the roads became stories. People told each other about places they could no longer reach. The cold was the kind that didn't just settle into your bones. It relocated there, made itself a permanent resident. And it was in the teeth of that cold, in the gray-blue hour just before full dark, that Clara Whitfield arrived in Black Hollow for the first time, sitting upright on the bench seat of a supply wagon, with her back straight and her chin level and her hands folded in her lap, like she was determined not to let anyone see how frightened she was. She was 28 years old. She had $43, a leather medical bag her father had left her, and exactly no one in the world waiting for her arrival. That was, she had decided, somewhere on the long road west, enough to start with. The wagon driver, a thick-set man named Dobbins, who had said perhaps 11 words to her over 3 days of travel, pulled the horses to a slow stop at the edge of town and cleared his throat. "This is it," he said, gesturing with one hand toward the row of buildings that constituted the entirety of Black Hollow. "Don't let 'em see you hesitate. They respect a person who walks like they know where they're going." Clara looked at the town. The town did not look particularly impressed by her presence. "What if I don't know where I'm going?" she asked. Dobbins thought about this for a moment. "Then walk faster," he said, and clicked his tongue at the horses, and was gone. Clara stood in the cold, with her bag in her hand, and let herself take one long breath. She had come here because Dr. Harlan Pierce, the only physician within 60 miles of Black Hollow, had written 3 months ago to the Eastern Medical Societies asking for a traveling nurt healer who could assist him with the ranching communities that spread across the territory like scattered communities, too far apart and too prideful to come into town until they were already half dead. Clara had answered the letter before she fully thought it through, and by the time she had thought it through, she had already committed, and that was that. She did not unmake commitments. It was perhaps her most defining characteristic, and occasionally her most inconvenient one. She walked toward the main street. She walked fast. The first person to speak to her was a woman sweeping the steps of what appeared to be a dry goods store, a broad-shouldered woman with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had evaluated a great many strangers and found most of them wanting. She stopped sweeping when Clara approached and looked her over from boots to hat brim with a slow, assessing gaze. "You the healer Pierce sent for?" the woman asked. "Clara Whitfield," Clara said, extending her hand. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at the hand. Then she shook it, briefly but firmly. "Mabel Greer. I run the boarding house on the East End." She tilted her head toward a 2-story building down the road. "Pierce said you'd need a room. He also said to tell you he's been delayed, broken axle on his buggy about 40 miles out. He'll be another week at least." A pause. "You're on your own until then." Clara absorbed this without changing her expression. "All right," she said. Mabel Greer studied for another moment as if reassessing. "You're either very calm or very foolish," she said. "In this territory, the difference matters." "I've found they often look the same from the outside," Clara said pleasantly. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. She stepped aside and gestured toward her boarding house. "Come have some supper," she said. "Before you do anything else, you should know something about this town." The supper was good venison stew with cornbread, the first hot meal Clara had eaten in 4 days, and over it, Mabel Greer gave her what Clara would later think of as the unofficial orientation to Black Hollow. She learned which ranching families needed medical attention and which would refuse it out of pride. She learned which roads were passable in this weather and which would kill a horse. She learned where the community well was, what time the supply wagons came through, and which of the town's 3 men who called themselves lawmen were actually worth the title. And she learned about Nathaniel Caldwell. "There's one rule I'll ask you to follow while you're working in this territory," Mabel said, refilling Clara's coffee without asking. "Stay away from the Caldwell ranch." Clara looked up from her stew. "Why?" Mabel's mouth tightened. "Because no good comes from going out there. The man is. He's not right, that's all. Something happened to him years ago, some trouble he brought on himself, and he came out of it scarred up and mean and closed off from every decent person in this county." "What kind of trouble?" Clara asked. "The kind decent people don't talk about at supper," Mabel said flatly. "The kind that follows a man because it belongs to him. That's all you need to know." Clara nodded slowly. She did not agree to stay away from the Caldwell ranch. She simply nodded, and Mabel Greer, who had not lived this long, without learning to read a person's silences, looked at her sharply. "I mean it," Mabel said. "The last woman who went out there to help with an injury came back white as a sheet and wouldn't say a word about what she'd seen." "What did she see?" His face, Mabel said quietly. "And whatever was behind his eyes." Clara went to bed that night, in a narrow room at the top of Mabel's stairs, listening to the wind against the window, thinking about a man everyone feared and no one would explain. She fell asleep telling herself she would learn what she needed to learn and make her own judgments. She did not expect to have the opportunity quite so soon. She found him 3 days later. She had not gone looking for him. She had spent those 3 days visiting the homesteads that Mabel had pointed her toward a family with a child running a winter fever, an elderly farmer whose knee had swollen to the size of a cantaloupe, a young mother still not recovered from a difficult birth 6 weeks earlier. She worked steadily and without complaint, and she discovered what she had half expected, that the people of Black Hollow were guarded at first. And then, when they realized she knew what she was doing and wasn't going to condescend to them or charge more than they could pay, they opened up with a directness and warmth she found deeply genuine. On the 3rd afternoon, she was riding back toward town along the frozen creek bed, not the most direct route, but the one that kept her away from the worst of the wind, when she saw the horse first, a big roan gelding, standing still at the edge of the creek, reins trailing, watching her approach with calm dark eyes, as if waiting for exactly this. Then she saw the man. He was on his side in the snow at the creek's edge, one leg caught at a wrong angle beneath him, one arm pulled in against his body. He wasn't moving. His coat was dark with something that wasn't just cold moisture. And Clara was out of her saddle and moving toward him before she had fully made the decision to do so. She dropped to her knees beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse, strong, too fast but strong. She exhaled. She moved her hands systematically, neck, spine, ribs, checking for the fractures that would make moving him fatal. The cold worked against her, making everything stiff, but she had done this before, in situations with less light and less certainty, and her hands knew their work even when her mind was frightened. His coat had come open at the front. Beneath it, on the left side, the gash was bad, a jagged line that had clearly come from a steer horn. From the look of it, deep enough to worry her but not, she thought, deep enough to have hit anything vital. The bleeding had slowed in the cold, which was the one mercy the temperature offered. She opened her medical bag and got to work. It was while she was pressing folded cloth against the wound with one hand and reaching for her needle and thread with the other that he regained consciousness. He came back suddenly and all at once, the way men often did, not gradually, but in a single violent lurch from nowhere, his body seizing upright, his hand coming out fast to grab her wrist. "Don't," he said, low, raw, barely above a whisper. His eyes found her face, dark eyes, burning with something between pain and warning. "Don't touch me." Clara did not flinch. She had learned, in the years she had spent doing this work, that a person in pain was not the same person they were when they were well, and that the right response to sudden fear was steadiness, not retreat. She met his eyes directly and kept her hand exactly where it was. "You're bleeding," she said, "and I'm going to close the wound. You can fight me afterward if you want, but right now, I need you to hold still." He stared at her. The hand on her wrist did not loosen, but it did not tighten. "Who?" he said. "Clara Whitfield. I'm a healer. I'm working out of Black Hollow." She tilted her head toward the wound without breaking eye contact. "The bleeding has slowed. which is good. But if you move around too much, it's going to open up again. And out here in this cold with no help close by, that becomes a very serious problem very quickly. So I'm asking you to let me work." A long silence. The wind moved between them. His grip on her wrist was iron-hard. She could feel the controlled strength in it, the way it held without crushing, and she could see him deciding something, working through something, turning some internal key she didn't yet understand. Then his hand dropped. "Do what you have to do," he said. She worked quickly and precisely. He did not make a sound. She had stitched wounds on men who had screamed and wept, and she had stitched wounds on men who had clenched their teeth and turned gray from the effort of silence. And this man was something else entirely. He simply endured it the way he might endure weather, as something that was happening and could not be altered, and so would simply be waited out. She found it more unnerving than the screaming, if she was honest with herself. It suggested a person who had learned too young that expressing pain was pointless. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. She had heard what they said about his face. She had gone to sleep 3 nights in a row, hearing Mabel Greer's voice saying the last woman came back white as a sheet, and she had prepared herself for something shocking, something grotesque, and what she found was not that. The scars were real, and they were severe. They crossed the left side of his face from just below his eye down to his jaw, layered and irregular, the kind of scarring that came from something that had burned and torn together, from fire and violence married in the same terrible moment. They had rearranged the geography of the left side of his face, pulled the corner of his mouth slightly, left one cheekbone slightly flattened, where it had been broken and healed imperfectly. They were impossible to ignore. But beneath them was a face that was striking in other ways. Strong jaw, a broad, serious forehead, dark eyes that were intelligent and observant and currently looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, wariness and something else, something half-buried. "You're not from here," he said. It was not a question. "No," she agreed. "I arrived 3 days ago. That explains it." "Explains what?" "Why you're still here." He said it without particular bitterness. Just stating a fact, as if he had simply accepted, long ago, that his presence was something people moved away from, and her continuing presence beside him was simply evidence she hadn't yet received the local information. Once you've been here longer, you'll know better. Clara began cleaning her instruments and packing them away. "No better than what? Than to stop for me." She paused in her packing. She looked at him, really looked at him, and what she felt was not pity, though she could recognize pity's general neighborhood. It was something older and more complicated. It was the feeling she got when she encountered something that had been broken in a very specific and purposeful way, not by accident but by design, by the repeated choices of other people who had something to gain from the breaking. "Someone needed help," she said simply. That's all it was. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you should leave before dark." "Can you walk?" she asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I can manage." "That's not what I asked." His jaw tightened. She could see the resistance in him, the reflex to say he was fine, that he needed nothing, that he had been managing alone for years and would continue to do so. "Thank you very much." She had seen that reflex in 100 patients and she understood it, but she also knew it was the single most dangerous thing a person in his condition could indulge, right now. "The horse," he said finally. "If you can help me to the horse." She helped him to the horse. It took longer than it should have, and required more of her strength than she had expected. And the sounds he made, not quite sounds, more like controlled silences that told her exactly how much pain he was in, were something she would remember for a long time. But he made it up into the saddle, and he sat there with his weight distributed carefully, his face tight and controlled, and he looked down at her. "The Caldwell Ranch," he said. "You know where it is?" "I know the direction," she said. "I'll make it from here." "I'll follow," she said. The look he gave her was complex irritation and surprise, and something she might have called gratitude if it hadn't been buried so deeply under everything else. "I told you I'll manage." "I heard you," Clarissa said, already moving toward her own horse. "I'm following anyway." She would learn later that nobody had followed Nathaniel Caldwell anywhere in 6 years. The ride to the ranch took and she could see with every passing minute that the 20 minutes cost him something. He stayed upright through will alone. She suspected the kind of stubbornness That was less a personality trait than a survival mechanism. Something the body had learned to do when giving in was not an option it could afford. He did not look back at her. He did not acknowledge her presence. But he also did not tell her again to go away, and she took that, in its quiet way, as something. The ranch itself was larger than she had imagined. She had expected something neglected, the physical expression of a man who had given up, but what she rode through was orderly and solid and maintained with obvious care. The fences were in good repair. The outbuildings were sealed against the cold. There was a large woodpile, stacked with a precision that spoke of serious purpose, and a barn that was well built and well kept. And the whole property had about it the quality of something a person had made very deliberately and maintained very seriously. Because it was the one thing in the world entirely his own. A hired hand, a young man with a worried face who introduced himself as Jesse came running from the barn when he saw Caldwell's state, and between the two of them, Clara and Jesse managed to get Nate off his horse and into the house. Nate said very little during this process. He directed them with single words and short gestures, his jaw clenched hard against the pain he would not name. They got him to a chair near the stove, and Clara checked her stitching, which had held, and redressed the wound with fresh bandage from her bag, and told him clearly and specifically what signs to watch for and what would require her return, and he listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention she associated with people who took information seriously, who would actually remember what she told them and act on it, rather than nodding politely and forgetting immediately. When she was done, she stood. "I'll come back in 3 days to check the wound," she said. "If there's fever before then, send Jesse to find me." She expected argument. She had been preparing her response to the argument the entire time she was working. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "Why didn't you leave?" It came out rough and raw and with a complicated texture she didn't have words for, yet not quite anger, not quite confusion, not quite something else. As if the question had been sitting in him since the creek, and this was the first moment it had been quiet enough for him to let it out. Clara picked up her bag. She thought about the question, took it seriously, the way he had apparently taken everything seriously, with the attention it deserved. She did not want to give him the easy answer, which was the polite one. She wanted to give him the true one. "Because you needed help," she said, "and no one else was there. That's all." She left before he could respond. But she felt his eyes on her back all the way to the door, and she thought not for the last time, and not without some alarm at her own certainty, that there was something in this man that was very much worth understanding. The town's response to her visit was immediate and clear. She was barely through the door of Mabel's boarding house before Mabel herself appeared from the kitchen with an expression that combined genuine worry with something dangerously close to "told you, so'd you." Behind her, hovering in the hallway as if they had been waiting, and Clara suspected they had been, were 2 other women who she had not yet properly met, but who had apparently learned somehow, with the remarkable speed of information in small communities, that the new healer had been to the Caldwell ranch. "Sit down," Mabel said, not unkindly. "I'm fine," Clara said. "I'm not asking because you look unwell," Mabel said. "I'm asking because you're about to hear something, and I'd rather you hear it sitting down." Clara sat. What followed was a conversation she would revisit many times in the weeks ahead, turning it over in her mind, examining it from different angles the way she might examine a specimen under glass. 3 women told her, collectively and with genuine conviction, and with what she could only interpret as sincere concern for her welfare, the story of Nathaniel Caldwell as Black Hollow understood it. He had come to the territory 8 years ago, they said. Purchased the land, good land, valuable land, land that more than one established rancher had wanted for himself, and set up his operation with the kind of quiet efficiency that had made people notice him before the scars even entered the conversation. He had kept to himself, but not rudely so, had done business honestly, had been on the way to becoming a respected member of the community. Then the incident. They spoke about the incident, the way people speak, about a local disaster that has become myth through the retelling slightly different in each version. Each teller adding or subtracting details that had shifted over the years of repetition, but agreeing on the core: a violent confrontation, a fire, injuries that would have killed a lesser man, and Nathaniel Caldwell emerging from it with a face the territory would never let him forget. And the rumors. The rumors had come afterward, and they had been specific, and they had been damaging, and they had, over 6 years, calcified into something that functioned like fact in the minds of nearly everyone in Black Hollow, that he had done something terrible to deserve what happened to him, that the violence had been of his own making, that whatever he had lost the community's respect, the possibility of connection, the ordinary human currency of being looked at without fear he had brought on himself. Clara listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She asked 2 or 3 precise questions that made Mabel look at her with a renewed sharp attention. And then she thanked them for their concern and said she would be careful, and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a man who had been left bleeding in the snow while the people around him chose the same direction away. She thought about the way he had held her wrist, without crushing it, the way he had listened to her instructions with that serious, exact attention, the way he had said, "Why didn't you leave?" with a tone that suggested he had been asking that question about everyone for 6 years, and had never once received an answer that made sense to him. She was not naive. She did not believe that goodness was always buried beneath a difficult surface waiting to be discovered by the right person willing to look. She had met genuinely dangerous people in her years of work, and she had not confused their danger for hidden depth. She understood the warnings she had been given. She also understood what she had seen. And what she had seen was a man who had not asked for help, had resisted it, had clearly expected her to leave, and had been not grateful, exactly, but something in the neighborhood of grateful, something that might grow into gratitude if given the space to develop. 3 days later, she went back to check the wound. Jesse met her at the gate with wide eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe she had returned, and walked her to the house without a word. Nate was in the barn when she arrived. He was working one-handed, careful, attending some petits of equipment with the focused concentration of a man who did not know how to do anything half-heartedly. He heard her come in and went still. Then he turned. The first thing he said was, "You actually came back." "I said I would," Clara said. "Most people who say things to me don't mean them." "Then you've been dealing with the wrong people," she says, setting her bag on the nearest clean surfaces. "Let me look at the stitching." He submitted to this with the same quality of controlled endurance he had shown at the creek. Not easy, not comfortable, but resolved. She removed the bandaging, examined the wound, confirmed it was healing cleanly, redressed it. She was aware the entire time of the quality of silence in the barn. Not uncomfortable. Something else. As if both of them were paying attention to something unspoken, some undercurrent moving below the practical surface of healer and patient, and neither of them had decided yet what to do with it. "You weren't on your land when you were injured," she said, without looking up from her work. "I was on the creek path. That land belongs to the Hartley homestead." A brief pause. "That's right," he said. "What were you doing out there?" Another pause. Longer. "The Hartley family has been having trouble with their fence line on the eastern edge. Cattle breaking through. Harv Hartley isn't well enough to fix it himself, and his son is 12 years old. I was addressing the problem." Clara smoothed the new bandaging into place. "On their land." Without being asked, Nate said, a slight bristle in his voice, as if she had accused him of something. "I don't go where I'm not." He stopped. "Harv's wife came to the edge of my property 3 weeks ago and asked. She looked like she'd spent a week getting her courage up to do it. A beat. She shouldn't have had to." Clara looked up at him. He was looking at a point somewhere over her left shoulder, jaw set, and she thought he might have surprised himself by saying that much, as if the words had been there and had simply come out before he decided whether to allow them. "That was a good thing you did," she said quietly. His eyes moved to her face. Something flickered in them there and gone. "Don't make it more than it was." "I'm not making it anything," she said. "I'm just saying what it was." She picked up her bag. He walked her to the door of the barn, which was more than he had done the first visit, and stood watching her while she collected her horse. She was almost out of the yard when he spoke. "Clara Whitfield." She stopped, turned. He was standing in the barn doorway, big and quiet and shadowed, and the look on his face was one she would carry with her for a very long time, something that was simultaneously walled off and reaching, the expression of a person who wanted something and had mostly stopped believing they were allowed to want it. "Thank you," he said, simple and direct, no qualifier. "No, but tacked to the end of it." She nodded. "I'll come back next week," she said. This time, he didn't argue. Over the weeks that followed, Clara came to understand something about Nathaniel Caldwell that the people of Black Hollow had either never known or had chosen to forget. He was not mean. He was not dangerous in any of the ways that mattered. He was a man who had been treated like a threat for so long that he had learned to occupy the role to hold himself at a distance, to speak in ways that gave nothing away, to make himself as large and closed and unapproachable as possible. Because it turned out that being feared was less painful than being pitied. He had made a kind of peace with the frontier of his own isolation, and he guarded it the way he guarded his property line, methodically, seriously, with the full application of his considerable will. But walls, Clara was learning, were not the same thing as their foundations. And the foundation of this man was something she had not been prepared for. She began to see it in pieces. In the way Jesse, who had worked the ranch for 2 years and clearly had the kind of loyalty that was earned rather than hired, spoke about Nate when Nate wasn't present. Not with the careful, qualified praise of a man covering for someone difficult. With something closer to the easy certainty of a person who had never found reason to doubt. She saw it in the fact that the Hartley fence, when she rode past it on her route, had been repaired with the same careful precision as everything. On Nate's own property, not done quickly to check a box, but done properly, the way you did something when it mattered to you. She saw it in the small boy from the neighboring Dunmore family who appeared at the edge of Nate's property line one afternoon while she was there, and who called out asking whether Mr. Caldwell had any spare nails he could spare, and Nate went into the barn and came back with a full tin of them and handed them over without ceremony, and the boy said thank you. And Nate said careful with the hammer, and the boy ran off, and the whole exchange took 40 seconds, and Nate said nothing about it afterward, as if it had never happened. "He does that a lot?" she asked. Nate looked up. "Does what?" "Gives things away." His expression shifted, not exactly discomfort, but something in that direction. "I have what I need," he said. "Some of them don't." She let it go, but she didn't forget it. What she also saw, and this she found harder to sit with, was what happened when she was leaving the ranch and passed through the edge of Black Hollow on her route back. The way people looked when they saw which direction she had come from. The way conversations paused. The way Mabel Greer asked, each time, with a carefully neutral face, whether she had been out east again, which was how the boarding house had taken to referring to the Caldwell Ranch, as if naming it directly gave it more reality than was comfortable. She went to the general store one afternoon for supplies and found herself standing behind 2 men who were talking with the casual certainty of people who had told themselves a story enough times that it had stopped feeling like a story. "You see Pierce's healer heading out to Caldwell's place again?" one of them said. "She doesn't know what she's getting herself into," the other said. "Or she does, and she doesn't care," the first one said, with a tone that made Clara's hands tighten on the handle of her basket. "Some women like that kind of thing. Feel sorry for a man, think they can fix him. She won't last," the second said with comfortable authority. "She'll see enough, they all do." Clara set her basket down on the counter and turned around. Both men looked at her, and then, to their credit, looked immediately uncomfortable. She had learned over the years that there was a particular expression she could wear that conveyed, without any words at all, the precise depth of her opinion of whatever she had just heard. She wore it now. "I'll let you both know," she said pleasantly, "if I find anything that requires your opinion." She turned back to the counter. She heard, behind her, the quality of silence that a person makes when they have been firmly and cleanly corrected and are deciding how to live with it. She finished her shopping and went back to her work. It was on her 4th visit to the ranch that Nate's walls first showed her their full height. She had come to check the wound one final time. It had healed well, better than she had expected given the depth of it, which told her something about his physical constitution. And they had fallen into what had become, without either of them quite deciding to allow it, something resembling a conversation. Not the careful clinical exchange of healer and patient. Something more mutual than that. He had asked her a question, a real one, about where she had learned her work, about the years she had spent before coming to Black Hollow, and she had answered honestly, and he had listened with that focused attention of his the kind that made her feel heard in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She had asked him in return, Something small. How long he had had the ranch. Whether it had always been cattle or had he considered other livestock. And something in his face had shut. Not dramatically. Not rudely. Just closed. The way a door closes when someone pulls it from the other side. One moment there and then not. The ease that had been, tentatively, beginning to develop between them was suddenly replaced by the careful, controlled distance he wore everywhere else, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she had brushed against something that had walls around it. 14 years, he said. His voice was level cattle. Then he stood and carried their coffee cups to the dry sink, and the conversation was over. She left without pushing, but she carried the image of that closing with her, the swiftness of it, the practice. The way a person didn't get that good at shutting down without having had a great deal of reason to practice. That night, sitting in her room at Mabel's, she found herself thinking about what people were built for versus what they had learned to settle for. About the difference between a person's nature and the walls they constructed around it. About the particular damage done to a person who was not dangerous and was treated as if they were, year after year, by enough people for long enough that they had finally accepted the treatment as earned. She thought about Nathaniel Caldwell's hands, big, scarred, careful pressing a tin of nails into a small boy's grip, without ceremony or expectation of thanks. She thought about the way he had said thank you to her. Simple, direct, as if he had decided to say it and said it, without decoration or qualifier, because that was the only honest way he knew how to do anything. She was not a woman who fell easily into anything. She had grown up in a world that taught women to perform their feelings rather than have them. And she had spent her adult life unlearning that lesson, learning to trust what she actually felt rather than what she was supposed to feel. And what she felt now, sitting in the cold of her small room, was a kind of recognition that she did not entirely know what to do with. She knew that Nathaniel Caldwell was not the man this town had decided he was. She did not yet know who he was instead. But she thought with a certainty she had learned over the years to trust that it was worth finding out. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the one after that, and somewhere in the rhythm of those visits, without either of them naming what was happening, a pattern established itself that both of them had stopped pretending was strictly medical. The wound was fully healed by the third week. Clara had told him so, plainly and professionally, and he had nodded, and there had been a silence between them, the particular kind of silence, at a crossroads, that asks without asking which direction a person intends to go. She had packed her bag, she had put on her coat, and then she had said, "I'll be back Thursday. I want to see how that tendon in your right hand is responding. You've been favoring it." He had looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "The tendon is fine," he said. "I'll see you Thursday," she said, and left. She told herself it was professional diligence. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. What she was sure of was this: she had been in Black Hollow for 6 weeks. And in those 6 weeks, she had developed a clearer picture of Nathaniel Caldwell than the rest of the town had managed in 6 years. And the picture bore no resemblance whatsoever to the one hanging in everyone else's mind. She saw it most clearly on a Thursday morning in late January, when she arrived at the ranch earlier than expected and found the yard occupied by a woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged, dressed in practical ranch clothes, standing near the fence post with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression on her face that Clara recognized immediately as the expression of a person who has spent a long time rehearsing what they need to say and is terrified of saying it. Nate was standing across from the woman, and he had gone very still in the way he went still when something caught him off guard. That particular stillness that was not calm but was the controlled surfaces over something that wasn't calm at all. Clara stayed near the gate. She was close enough to hear. "I know I have no right to ask you," the woman was saying. Her voice was tightly controlled, the way a voice gets when it's working very hard not to break. "After everything, after the things that were said about you, that I let people say, without that I never corrected. I know I have no right." Nate said nothing. "My husband's youngest brother," the woman continued. "He's been without work since September. It's been a hard winter. I heard you might be looking for a hand for the spring gather, and she stopped. Steadied herself. "I shouldn't have come." "What's his name?" Nate said. The woman blinked. Thomas Greer. He's 22, he's worked cattle since he was— Tell him to come Monday morning, Nate said, early. The woman stared at him. You. She pressed her lips together, and Clara could see her struggling with gratitude, and with something else. Something heavier and more complicated. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly, I owe you an apology for the things I didn't say when I should have said them. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Nate looked at the woman for a moment with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then he said, Monday morning, early, and turned and walked back toward the barn. Clara watched the woman leave. She watched the gate close. Then she walked to the barn and found Nate inside, doing what he always did when something had unsettled him, working. Hands moving, attention fixed on something physical and controllable, as if motion were a substitute for processing. That was the minister's wife, Clara said. I know who it is, Nate said, without turning around. She came to ask a favor, and you gave it to her before she finished asking. The boy needs work. His hands kept moving. I need a hand. It's a practical arrangement, Nate. He went still. She almost never used his given name, and they both knew it. He turned around slowly, and she looked at him. Really looked at him. The way she had learned to look at patients when she needed to see past the surface to what was actually happening beneath. She was one of the people who didn't correct the stories about you, Clara said. You knew that. You gave her son-in-law a job anyway. Brother-in-law, he said. That's not the point. What is the point, Clara? Not angry, but something in his voice had an edge to it, not directed at her, she thought, but at something larger, at the conversation itself, at the territory it was moving into. The point, she said quietly, is that you are not the person this town decided you were. And I think you've spent so long being treated like you are that you've stopped being sure of the difference. The barn was very quiet. Outside the wind moved. She could hear the horses shifting in their stalls, the small sounds of a working property, doing what working properties did in winter, existing, enduring, waiting for the season to change. Nate looked at her for a long moment, then he looked away. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. But his voice had lost its edge, and what was left was something rawer and less defended, and she thought that was closer to the truth of it. Tell me what I'm missing, she said. Tell me what I don't know. He picked up the piece of equipment he had been working on and turned it in his hands. Put it down. Picked it up again. She had learned that this was what he did when he was deciding something, when the decision was real and cost him something. Not today, he said finally. She recognized the words for what they were, a door left not locked but not open either. A not yet rather than a never. All right, she said simply, and went to check on Jessie's hand, which she had been monitoring since the young man had caught it in a gate hinge 2 weeks earlier, and the morning continued, and the door stayed where it was. But it stayed unlocked, and they both knew it. The weeks that followed had a texture that Clara would later think of as the particular texture of trust being built by hand. The way something is built when the person doing the building doesn't entirely believe in the project and keeps stopping to test the joints before going further, making sure each piece can bear weight before adding the next. Nate was the builder, and she was not sure what she was. The reason he kept coming back to the project, maybe. The person who didn't leave when he put the tools down. He began to talk to her. Not easily, not freely, not the way a person talks who has had the luxury of being listened to their whole life. Carefully. In the way of a man releasing water through a controlled channel, managing the flow, keeping hold of the valve. But the things he told her, those small pieces, formed a picture she had not expected. He had grown up in Kentucky, he said one afternoon. He had come west young, 21, with nothing but the money he'd earned from 3 years of cowhand work and the specific ambition to own something he'd built himself. He had bought the land when it was mostly raw country, and he had worked it with his hands for years before it became what it was now. He talked about that early period, the isolation, the physical work, the way a man learns who he is when he's got no one else's expectations to perform for, with a quality that was not quite pride, but was something in that neighborhood. Something like deep satisfaction. Like the quiet of a man who has looked at what he built and found it solid. He did not talk about the incident, not directly, not yet. But it moved through everything else he said. The way a river moves under ice, present. Definitive, exerting pressure on the shape of everything above it. She could trace its outline in what he avoided. in the way certain years were spoken of carefully, like ground with weak spots, and he placed his words precisely to step around them. In the way he spoke about trust not as an abstraction but as a specific damaged thing, something that had been whole, and had been broken so thoroughly that he had stopped believing they could be rejoined into anything functional. "You trust someone," she said one day. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. Once he said, "Yes. And they made their choices," he said, "and I paid for them." A pause. "That's enough on that, all right," she said. She let it rest. But she held the shape of it carefully in her mind, turning it, because she was beginning to understand that the wound she was treating in Nathaniel Caldwell had very little to do with the scar on his side that had healed clean and well weeks ago. The wound that mattered was older and deeper and had never been properly attended to. It had been left to close on its own, the way wounds do, when there's no one to treat them imperfectly, with the kind of scar tissue that goes too deep and changes the movement of everything around it. He understood something else too, and it settled in her with a weight she had not anticipated. She was not here because she felt sorry for him. She had examined that possibility carefully, the way she examined everything she felt carefully, not trusting the first version of her own emotions any more than she trusted the first version of a patient's account of their symptoms. And what she found when she looked honestly was not pity. It was something much more straightforward and much more inconvenient. She respected him. She had not expected to respect anyone in Black Hollow so completely and so quickly, and yet here it was solid and undeniable, built of specific evidence, of the minister's wife and the tin of nails, and the fence on Hartley land, and the way he listened, the way he actually listened, with his whole attention, as if what she was saying were the most important data he had received in some time. She had spent her adult life in the company of people who listened with half their minds, while the other half prepared their response. And this man listened the way she imagined the best doctors listened. Not waiting, but actually hearing. That was the thing she had not been warned about. That he was, underneath all of it, exceptional. Not in a showy or declared way, but in the quiet, structural way of a person who had a very clear set of values and lived by them without advertising the fact. Thomas Greer, the brother-in-law, came on Monday morning, as instructed, and was by the following week clearly absorbed into the working life of the ranch, with an ease that said something about the way Nate managed, not with the kind of authority that came from fear, but with the kind that came from competence, from knowing exactly what needed to be done, and being clear about it, without drama. She watched Nate with Thomas one afternoon giving direction, correcting technique, not with impatience, but with the matter-of-fact persistence of someone for whom getting the job done right was the only available option. And she thought of the 12-year-old Hartley boy and the family with their door left food at in winter, and the woman at the gate asking for more than she believed she deserved to ask. She thought, this is who he is. This is the man beneath the walls. And then she thought, with a start that was half alarm and half something else entirely, when did I stop visiting to check a wound and start visiting because I cannot imagine not coming back? She did not have a good answer to that. She went home to Mabel's that night and sat with the question for a long time, and finally she stopped trying to answer it and simply acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged things she could not immediately resolve, with honesty, without panic, with the understanding that the truth of something did not require her to act on it immediately. But it was true. That was the undeniable part. It was simply true. She was not the only one who had noticed either. She became aware of it gradually, the way a temperature changes gradually, until you realize you are no longer cold but cannot pinpoint exactly when that stopped. The awareness came in small, accumulated details. The way Nate watched for her horse coming up the road and was always somehow outside when she arrived, as if he had coincidentally chosen that moment to attend to something near the front of the property. The way he had, without her asking and without acknowledging it, made sure there was always coffee ready when she came. The way their conversations had expanded organically, without pressure to include things that had nothing to do with medicine or ranching or the practical businesses of either of their lives, and everything to do with the kind of conversation people have when they have started to understand that the person in front of them is someone they want more of. He had asked her one afternoon about her family. She had answered carefully, the way she always answered that question. With the abbreviated version she had refined over years of being a woman alone in the world, parents gone, no siblings. The long apprenticeship under a doctor in Philadelphia who had been her only real family for the last decade, and who had died of a fever 3 years ago, and left her both the medical bag and the particular brand of grief that comes from losing the one person who truly knew you. She expected the polite expression of sympathy that this account usually produced. What she got instead was several seconds of quiet, and then, "That's a particular kind of alone," Nate said. Low and direct, the kind where you don't just lose the person, you lose the version of yourself that existed with them. She had looked at him. Something had moved in her chest, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular sensation of being understood without having to explain first. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it is," he had nodded. Not pressing, not performing sympathy. Just acknowledging what she had said with the seriousness it deserved. That was the afternoon, she thought. I am in considerable difficulty here. She rode home that evening, with her coat pulled against the cold, and her mind working into two directions simultaneously, the practical and the emotional, the careful and the wanting. She was not a woman who failed to understand her own feelings. She understood them quite well. What she was less sure of was what to do with the understanding. He was a man who had been alone for 6 years, who had built walls of such specific construction and careful maintenance that she suspected even he had forgotten what it had felt like before he built them, who flinched at unexpected kindness, the way a person flinches at a sudden loud noise, not from weakness but from deeply conditioned reflex. The reflex of a person who had learned that kindness was usually the first move in a game that ended badly. She did not know yet what had happened to him, but she knew it had changed the architecture of everything that came after. She was 3 miles from the ranch when she heard the sound fast hoofbeats, a horse being ridden hard in the direction she had just come from, and then Jesse's voice calling her name across the cold air. She turned her horse. Jesse pulled up beside her, breathing hard, his face tight with the specific expression of someone managing controlled panic. "You need to come back," he said. "There's a family at the gate. Ma and 3 kids. The youngest one, Clara, I've never seen a fever like that in a child that small." She had already turned her horse toward the ranch. The child's name was Annie, and she was 4 years old, and the fever she was running was the kind that frightened Clara in a very focused and professional way. The mother, a young woman named Ruth Denny, whose husband Clara gathered was somewhere between absent and gone, in a way that wasn't being discussed, had ridden 2 hours through the cold with her 3 children because she had no one else to go to. The nearest doctor was Pierce, who was a far eastern part of the territory on an emergency of his own. Someone had told her there was a healer at the Caldwell ranch, and she had come. Clara worked quickly. She had what she needed. She had learned in the first week to carry a comprehensive kit because in this territory you never knew how far from town you would find a crisis. She gave the child fever medicine, worked to bring the temperature down, monitored the breathing. The mother sat absolutely rigid in the nearest chair, holding her other 2 children against her sides, her face white and controlled with the specific kind of terror that is too large to express and so is held in. Nate had come in without being called when the horses had arrived. He had stayed near the doorway for the first few minutes, giving Clara the space and light she needed to work. Then, without fanfare, he had taken the older 2 Denny children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, both of them wide-eyed and trembling with cold and fear, and he had taken them to the kitchen, and she could hear, through the wall, the sounds of the stove being stoked and something warm being prepared, and the boy's frightened voice asking questions, and Nate answering them, simply and directly, in that low steady voice of his. The child's fever began to break at the 2-hour mark. Clara sat back and let herself breathe. Ruth Denny made a sound. She immediately pressed her hand over something that was half sob and half the desperate release of fear that has been held in containment for too long. "She's going to be all right?" she asked. "The fever's coming down," Clara said. "I want to watch her for a few more hours to be sure. You're staying here tonight." It was not a question. Ruth Denny clearly recognized this and did not argue. Nate, when Clara went to find him, was in the kitchen with the 2 older children. The boy was asking him about cattle, the very specific Rapid-fire questioning of a 7-year-old who has found a subject and intends to extract every available fact from the nearest expert, and Nate was answering each question with the same straightforward patience. He lied to every... The kind of patient attention that small children, who were excellent judges of whether an adult was truly listening or merely appearing to, responded to immediately. The girl had fallen asleep against Nate's arm on the bench beside him, her small face entirely relaxed, one fist curled against her cheek. Nate looked up when Clara appeared. There was something in his expression she had not seen there before, or perhaps she had seen it before, but in smaller doses, and the accumulated weight of it was what was new. Something that was trying not to be moved and was not entirely succeeding. "She'll be all right," Clara said quietly. He nodded. His hand moved, briefly and unconsciously, to settle the sleeping girl more securely against his arm. Clara watched this. She felt something happen in her chest that she was not prepared to name in this particular moment, in this particular kitchen, with a 7-year-old asking questions about the spring gather. She went back to Ruth Denny and her recovering daughter. The Denny family stayed the night, as Clara had said they would. Ruth slept in the chair beside her daughter. The older children were settled in the spare room, with Jessie watching over them. Clara dozed in the chair near the door, her medical bag within reach. Nate did not sleep. She knew because she woke in the early hours. And he was there, not looming, not intrusive, simply present, sitting near the cold stove with a cup of something and a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who is accustomed to spending nights alone with his thoughts. "You should rest," she said quietly, so as not to wake Ruth. "I will," he said. Not defensive, not dismissive, just something she was still learning the language of. She looked at him across the quiet room. In the low light, his scars were shadowed, and the whole terrible weight of what had been done to him by this town, and by whoever had come before the town, was somehow more visible than it was in daylight, when he had his armor in place. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been tired for a very long time. "Nate," she said softly. He looked at her. "You're a good man," she said. Not with emphasis. Not with the quality of someone trying to convince. Just as a statement of observed fact, way she might state that the fever had broken or the wound had healed. The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever heard from him. She watched him receive the words, watched him resist them in the first second, the way she had known he would, the reflex of rejection fully operational, and then watched something else happen, something quieter and harder to name, some small crack in the wall that the evening had opened and the words had found. He looked away first. "Go back to sleep, Clara," he said. His voice was different, rougher, as if something had shifted the ground beneath it. She closed her eyes, but for a long time she did not sleep. By morning, the Denny girl was dramatically improved children. Clara had always found, bounced back with a speed that seemed almost unfair compared to adults. Ruth Denny, standing at the gate with her children around her, ready to ride home in the pale winter morning, looked at Nate with an expression that had layers in it. Clara could not entirely read gratitude, certainly, and something else. A reassessment of something she had held fixed in her mind. "Mr. Caldwell," Ruth said. "I didn't," she stopped. Started again. "I was one of the people who stayed away. I want you to know that I know what that cost you. And I'm sorry for it." Nate held the gate open. "Ride safe," he said. "The road near the Denny Creek has ice on the left shoulder. Stay right." Ruth Denny looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded and clicked to her horse, and her small family moved up the road. Clara stood beside Nate and watched them go. She could feel the tension in him, the controlled way he managed the thing that had just been said, pressing it down into the place where he kept everything that cost him. "You could have said something," she said quietly. "You could have said you accepted the apology." "I did accept it," he said. "She doesn't know that." A pause. "She will," he said. "Actions say it more reliably than words." Clara thought about this. About a man who had learned not to trust words, not his own, not anyone else's, and who had built an entire alternative language out of what he did instead of what he said. The fence on Hartley land, the nails in the boy's hand. A job for a young man whose family had done nothing to deserve the favor. A sleeping child held carefully against an arm, while her brother asked questions about cattle. "You've been speaking that language for a long time," she said. Not quite to him, more as if she were working something out. He looked at her sideways. "What language?" The one where you do instead of say, she said. The one where you show people who you are instead of telling them. Because somewhere along the way you stopped believing telling would work. The quiet between them was different from other quiet. It had a charge to it, the specific electrical quality of a silence that is sitting on something real. You see too much, he said finally. His voice was low and there was something in it that was almost a complaint, but wasn't. That was trying to be a complaint and resolving into something else. I see what's there, she said. He turned then and looked at her directly, fully, without the careful management he usually applied to looking at her, and she looked back without flinching. And the morning held them in it for a long moment, that neither of them broke, and neither of them resolved. Then he looked away. He picked up the rope coiled on the fence post, the way he always picked up whatever tool was nearest when a conversation moved into territory that scared him. I'll need to ride the north fence today, he said. I know, she said. You don't have to stay. I know that too, she said. She stayed, and he did not this time tell her to go. She worked beside Jesse all morning, while Nate was on the north fence line, attending to the small medical tasks that had accumulated Jesse's hand, a cut on Thomas Greer's forearm that needed checking, a question from Thomas about his own son who had been coughing for a week back in town. She answered everything and wrote a note for Thomas to take to his wife with specific instructions. She was packing her bag to leave when Thomas said, with the careful, indirect approach of someone who wants to say something but isn't sure of their footing, he's different. When you're here, Clara looked up. Thomas was not looking at her. He was examining the fence post nearest to him with excessive interest. Different how? She asked. Less, I don't know the right word, a pause. Less like he's waiting for something bad to happen. She absorbed this, finished packing her bag. That's an interesting observation, she said. Thomas shrugged, embarrassed now, clearly wishing he hadn't started. He's a good man, he said. Everybody in town who actually deals with him knows it. But most of them deal from a distance, so. He cleared his throat. That's all I meant. I know, Clara said. She was at her horse when Nate came back from the north fence. He pulled up and looked at her packed bag, at the horse ready. Leaving? He said. I need to check on the Whitmore children this afternoon, she said. The two youngest have been coughing. He nodded. He stayed on his horse. She stayed on hers. Thursday, he said, not a question. Thursday, she confirmed. She rode out of the yard and did not look back, because she knew that if she looked back, she would see him watching her go. And she was not entirely sure what that knowledge was doing to the very careful and rational approach she had been trying to take to all of this. She rode toward town. The cold pressed against her face. The sky above the Wyoming mountains was the pale, brilliant blue of deep winter, clear and enormous and indifferent. She thought, something is coming, not in a frightened way. In the way you think it, when you can feel the shape of something forming in the distance, can feel the pressure of it in the air even before it arrives. Something is coming, and I am not going to be able to stand to one side of it when it does. She did not know yet that the thing forming in the distance had a name, and that his name was Charles Whitmore, and that when he arrived in Black Hollow, 3 weeks later, everything she had been quietly building with Nathaniel Caldwell, every careful piece of trust, and every unlocked door, and every morning of coffee, and every silence that had been its own kind of conversation, every bit of it would be put under pressure she had not anticipated and had not prepared for. She did not know any of that yet. She rode toward town, through the brilliant cold, and she thought about a man who did instead of said, and a sleeping child against his arm, and a voice that had gone rough around the edges of 3 simple words. You're a good man, she thought. I meant it. I would say it again. I would say it as many times as it takes for him to believe it. She thought, I am very much in trouble. And somewhere behind her, at the north edge of his property, Nathaniel Caldwell stood at his fence line and watched the road long after there was nothing left on it to see. Charles Whitmore arrived in Black Hollow on a Tuesday, which was the day Clara came to the ranch, and she knew something was wrong before she had fully dismounted. Because Nate was standing at the gate instead of somewhere on the property working, and Nate never simply stood. He was a man who was always in motion, always with his hands on something useful, and when he was still, it meant something had stopped him. She came through the gate and looked at his face. Someone came to see me this morning, he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, not anger exactly, though anger was somewhere in the neighborhood. Something older and more controlled than anger. Something that had been living in him a long time and had simply been reactivated, the way an old injury makes itself known when the weather changes. "Who?" she asked. "Charles Whitmore." He said the name the way you say the name of something you have a long history with, and none it good. "He's back." Clara had heard the name twice since arriving in Black Hollow. Once from Mabel, in a passing reference she hadn't followed up on. Once from old Harv Hartley, who had mentioned it with the particular careful vagueness of a man who considered the topic genuinely dangerous. She had filed it and waited, because she had learned that in this territory, the things people were most careful about were usually the things most worth knowing. "Tell me," she said. He turned and walked toward the barn, which meant he was going to talk, but he needed to be moving while he did it. She followed. "Whitmore owned the largest cattle operation in this county 8 years ago," Nate said. His voice was even and measured, the voice he used when he was managing something. "He wanted my land from the beginning. The water accessed the creek that runs through the eastern quarter. It's the only reliable year-round source in a 20-mile stretch. He made me 3 offers in my first 2 years here. I turned down all 3, and Clara said." Nate was quiet for a moment. His hands found a piece of harness that needed turned repairing. Though she could tell, he wasn't actually seeing it. "And then he found another way," he said. She waited. "There was a man named Garrett Cole," Nate said. "He worked for me. Came highly recommended, good with cattle, good with horses. I trusted him. I considered him a friend." A pause. Brief and controlled, but she heard what was in it. He had been in Whitmore's pay from the beginning. "I didn't know that. It took me a year to understand it, after everything had already happened." "What did Cole do?" Clara asked. Nate set the harness down. He put both hands on the top rail of the stall and looked straight ahead. "He set the fire," he said. "Whitmore needed me discredited. He needed a story that would make the territory want to be rid of me. Cole set fire to the eastern barn during a night when 3 of my neighbors' horses were stabled there for the winter horses they'd asked me to shelter, because their own stables had been flooded. When I went in to get the horses out." He stopped. A short, hard stop. "I got the horses out. I didn't get out as clean." Clara said nothing. She stood very still and let him have the room the telling required. "Cole disappeared that night," Nate continued. "Before I was out of the doctor's care, Whitmore had already put a different story into circulation. That I had set the fire myself. That I was violent, unstable, that the scarring was justice for what I'd done. By the time I was well enough to defend myself, the story had been told so many times it had become true in people's minds." He finally turned and looked at her. "I tried to find Cole for 2 years. Whitmore moved him out of the territory. And without Cole to contradict the story, there was nothing I could prove. So I stopped trying to prove it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was feeling something that was partly fury, clean, cold, specific fury at the particular cruelty of what had been done to him, and partly the sensation of a puzzle resolving, every piece she had gathered over the past weeks, clicking into place. The walls, the wariness, the practiced isolation. The way he did, instead of said, because words had been used against him so effectively that he had stopped trusting them as currency. "And now Whitmore is back," she said. "Now Whitmore is back." Nate's voice was flat. "He came this morning to make me a 4th offer. More money than the first 3 combined. Very polite, very reasonable, a beat. Told me the territory was changing. That there were investors interested in developing the water access commercially. That things were going to become complicated for smaller operations that couldn't prove clear and uncontested title to their land." Clara understood immediately. "He's threatening to contest your land claim. He has a lawyer coming from Cheyenne," Nate said. "Apparently there are questions about the original survey. Questions that didn't exist 8 years ago and have somehow materialized now." His jaw tightened. "He gave me 2 weeks to think about his offer." "He gave you 2 weeks to be frightened," Clara said. Something crossed Nate's face, a brief, complicated expression that had recognition in it, and something else. Something that might have been the particular feeling of being understood at exactly the right speed. "Yes," he said. Clara sat down on the nearest stable bench. She was thinking fast, the way she thought when a patient, presented with something complicated, not reacting, but assessing, mapping the problem, looking for where the pressure points were. "The survey questions," she said. "Are they legitimate? They could be made to look legitimate, Nate said. A crooked surveyor, a lawyer who knows how to file in the right courts. It would take time and money to fight, and while it was being fought, any bank in the territory would freeze credit against the contested property. He paused. It would ruin me, not immediately, but it would ruin me. And Cole, Clara said, is he still gone? I don't know where Cole is, Nate said. I stopped looking 2 years ago. Clara looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had come to know, the careful waiting look of a man who had learned not to expect much from the people around him and was perpetually braced for the moment when they confirmed that expectation. The moment when the situation became too complicated or too dangerous, and the reasonable thing was to step back. She thought about what he had said, the first time she had come back after the wound healed, when she had asked if she needed a reason. She thought about Thursday, said in that flat, certain voice, not a question. She thought about the sleeping girl against his arm, and the tin of nails in a small boy's hands. All right, she said. Tell me everything, every detail about Whitmore, about Cole, about the fire, about the land survey. Everything you know and everything you suspect. Start from the beginning. He stared at her. Clara, I am not going anywhere, she said quietly. Not with force, not with drama, just with the simple certainty of a statement of fact. And I am not going to pretend this isn't happening. So sit down and tell me everything, because we're going to need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The silence stretched. She watched him navigate. It watched him move through the resistance, through the reflex that said, don't. That said it's too much to ask anyone to carry. That said the reasonable thing is to protect her from this. She watched all of that move across his face in a matter of seconds, and then she watched him sit down on the bench across from her. And he told her everything. It took 2 hours. He spoke with the controlled precision of a man who had gone over the facts many times in private, who had examined them from every angle in the long nights of his isolation, and who had never had anyone to tell them to. She asked questions when she needed clarity and stayed quiet when he needed space, and by the end of it she had a complete picture that was worse, in some ways, than she had imagined and better. In others, worse, because the deliberateness of what Whitmore had done was thorough and long planned. A man who had waited 8 years to make another move was a man with patience and resources and the kind of specific, cold determination that didn't exhaust itself. Better, because Nate had, without fully recognizing it, spent 8 years building something Whitmore hadn't accounted for. He had the loyalty of every person he had quietly helped: the Hartleys, the Greers, the Dennys, a dozen other families who knew what he had done for them, even if they had been too frightened of his reputation to say so publicly. That was not nothing. In a territory where a man's word was his most valuable asset, the goodwill of 20 families was a counterweight Whitmore had not calculated. She told Nate this. He shook his head. They won't stand up, he said. Not against Whitmore's lawyer. You don't know that, she said. I know this territory, he said. I know how people behave when a powerful man makes the other side seem dangerous. You've been the dangerous side, Clara said steadily. You've let them believe it. You've made it easier for them to believe it, by never asking them to believe anything different. He looked at her sharply. I'm not criticizing you, she said. I understand why. When you've been betrayed that completely by someone you trusted, asking anyone for anything starts to feel like offering them a weapon. I understand it. But Nate, those people owe you, and some of them know it. And if someone asked them, someone to simply tell the truth about what you've done for them. You, he said, not a question. His voice had changed. Something in it had tightened. You're talking about, you asking them. I know most of the families in this valley by now, she said. I've treated half of them. They talk to me, Clara. His voice was very quiet now, and it had something in it she hadn't heard before, something that was fear, but not the fear of Whitmore or legal contests or ruined land. A different kind of fear, a more personal one. This is not your fight. I know that, she said. I'm choosing to be in it anyway. You don't understand what Whitmore does to people who stand against him. Tell me he ruins them, Nate said, quietly, systematically. He has money and lawyers and patience, and he uses all three. And when he's done, the person who stood against him has nothing left except the knowledge that they were right. He leaned forward, and she could see in his face the effort of what he was saying, that this was not a general warning, that this was specific and personal and aimed at her with a precision that cost him something to deploy. I will not let that happen to you. I won't have it. The barn was very quiet. Clara looked at him at the fear in his face that was actually, underneath it, something she recognized as care. As the specific, frightened care of a person who has found something they cannot afford to lose and is only now realizing they cannot afford to lose it. Nathaniel, she said. She used his full name deliberately, the way she used his given name when she needed him to hear her, and not just the shape of what she was saying. Listen to me. I came to Black Hollow because a letter asked me to. I stayed past my medical reason because I chose to. I am here right now because I want to be here. These are my choices. Not yours to make. He said nothing. His jaw was working, she could see it, the small controlled movement of a man keeping something in. I am not Ruth Denny showing up at your gate needing help, she said. I am not the minister's wife asking for a favor. I am asking you to let me be in this the way you would be in it if the positions were reversed. Without being managed. Without being protected from something I am choosing to walk toward. The silence that followed was the longest of all the silences she had sat with this man through, and there had been many of them, and she had learned to read their qualities. This one had the quality of something fundamental being rearranged. Something being relocated inside him. You'd do that, he said finally. It came out rough. You'd actually do that. I'm sitting here, aren't I, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, and she saw something move across his face that she had not seen there before, something cracked open and raw and real, something that had been kept in the dark for a very long time and was encountering light with the careful, pained adjustment of something that had grown unaccustomed to it. He said, very quietly, to the middle's distance, I don't know how to let someone do that. I know, she said with equal quiet, but you're going to learn. She rode into town that afternoon alone, before the light was gone, and she went to see Mabel Greer. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat on her first night in Black Hollow, when Mabel had told her to stay away from the Caldwell ranch, and she looked at the older woman across the scrubbed wood and she said, Tell me what you actually know about Charles Whitmore. Not what you've heard, what you know. Mabel was quiet for a moment. She poured coffee for both of them, which Clara recognized as a sign that this was going to be a real conversation, and not a managed one. I know he's a man who wants things and finds ways to get them, Mabel said finally. I know that 3 ranches in this county that used to belong to other people now belong to him, and in each case there was a period before the sale where the original owner had problems. Legal problems mostly, or reputation problems. She paused. I know that I never believed everything that was said about Nathaniel Caldwell, but I also never said so. Because Whitmore is the kind of man you don't say things against without being very sure of your footing. And your footing now? Clara asked. Mabel looked at her steadily. You're asking me to say something. What are you asking me to say? I'm asking if you'd be willing to tell the truth about what you know of Nate Caldwell, Clara said. Not in a courtroom, not yet, but to your neighbors. To the people who listen to you. To the people who've been believing a story for 6 years because no one they trusted told them the story was wrong. Mabel was quiet for a long time. Clara let her be quiet. He fixed my fence, Mabel said finally. It came out like a confession, like something she'd been holding. 2 winters ago. A storm took out the section near the east corner. I hadn't met him directly at that point, just seen him at a distance. I woke up the next morning and it was repaired. No note. No request for anything. I knew it was him because Jesse had been seen on my road the night before. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I never thanked him. I didn't know how to thank a man I'd been treating as someone to avoid. She paused. That's sat with me. It doesn't have to keep sitting with you, Clara said. Mabel looked at her sharply. Then she looked down at the cup. Then she said, What do you need me to do? By the end of that evening, Clara had spoken to Mabel, to Ruth Denny by messenger, to the minister's wife, and to old Harv Hartley, who had come into town for supplies, and who listened to everything she said with his arms crossed and his eyes very steady, and then said, I've been waiting for someone to say this out loud for 2 years. Tell me what you need. She rode back to the ranch in the dark. It was later than she should have been on the road and colder, and she made the ride anyway because she could not leave it until tomorrow. Nate was in the house when she arrived, which was unusual. He was almost always still outside at this hour, finding one more thing to attend to in the last light. He was sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of him and an expression on his face. That told her he had been doing what she did, which was thinking in two directions at once, and not finding either direction particularly comfortable. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face and he read it the way he read things, quickly, completely, drawing accurate conclusions from the evidence without asking. His expression shifted. "You talk to people," he said. "Several of them," she said, and she pulled off her coat and sat across from him. "Harv Hartley is willing to make a formal statement about the fence repairs you did on his land over the past 3 years, the prices you paid him fairly for cattle, when you could have paid less, and the fact that you have never, in 6 years of being his neighbor, given him any reason to believe the things that are said about you." She paused. "Mabel Greer will talk to every woman on her circuit. That's 11 families. Ruth Denny is writing a letter." Another pause. "The minister's wife wants to arrange a meeting at the church." Nate stared at her. "They were waiting," she said. "Most of them. They had information they didn't know what to do with, and they'd been silent. So long they thought silence was the only available choice. But they were waiting for someone to open a different door." His jaw worked. "Nate," she said gently, "people have seen who you are. They've been seeing it for years. They just needed permission to say so." He put both hands flat on the table. She could see the effort of what he was managing, the enormous, overwhelming difficulty of receiving something you have spent years being certain you would never receive, of being seen clearly and correctly by people who had every reason to look away. "Why?" he said. His voice was rough. Not asking why they were willing. Asking something larger than that. "Because the truth is the truth," she said, "regardless of how long a different story has been told." He looked down at the table. She gave him the silence. And then, into the silence, he said something that cost him more than she had heard anything cost him yet. "I thought I was beyond this," he said. "I thought I had settled it. In my own mind, that I didn't need them to believe it. That it was enough to know the truth myself." A pause. "I was wrong. It wasn't enough. I just told myself it was, because the alternative was wanting something I didn't believe I could have." Clara said nothing. She let the words exist in the room without rushing to fill around them. "I wanted them to know," he said quietly. "I always wanted them to know. I just stopped expecting it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She did it without thinking, without the deliberation she normally applied to things, without checking first whether it was the right move or the wise one. It was simply what the moment required, and she did it. He looked at her hand on his. He was very still. "You don't have to stop expecting it," she said. "Not anymore." He turned his hand beneath hers, a slow, careful movement, as if he were handling something fragile and valuable and uncertain of its weight, and he held on. Neither of them said anything for a long time. It was Jesse who interrupted them, coming in from the barn with an urgency in his step that pulled both of them upright. The young man's face was tight. "Sorry to come in like this," he said. "But Thomas rode by from town 10 minutes ago. Said there's a meeting being organized. At the saloon. Whitmore's calling it." He looked at Nate. "He's telling people that the county sheriff needs to look into the land claim dispute. Officially. He's got 3 men from Cheyenne with him who he's calling land assessors." A pause. "He's telling people that you've been operating on contested land for 8 years and the previous owner's family never received what they were owed." Clara felt Nate's hand tighten on hers once, then he released it and stood up. "That's the story," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "That's the story he's starting. He doesn't have to prove it. He just has to make it loud enough that people start asking questions. And the questions themselves do the damage." "He's moving fast," Clara said. "He came back prepared," Nate said. "He's been planning this." He looked at her. "This is what he does. He doesn't come at you directly. He comes at your reputation first, because if your reputation goes, you have nothing left to defend the rest with. Then we move faster," she said. "Clara." "The church meeting," she said. "How soon can the minister's wife organize it?" "I don't know. Days, a week maybe. It needs to be tomorrow," she said. She was already picking up her coat. "Tonight, if possible. Before Whitmore's saloon meeting settles into people's minds as the first version of the story. The first version is always the one people remember." Nate looked at her with an expression she had no precedent. For reading something so layered and complex, she could only stand in it and wait for it to resolve into something she had language for. It was part fear and part something that was not fear at all. something that was its direct opposite, something that looked, she thought, and the thought arrived with a force that surprised her, like the particular expression of a person who has found, against all the odds they had arranged, against themselves, a reason to hope. "You're going back out in that cold?" "Yes," she said. "It's nearly full dark. I know the road." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she had to tilt her head to look at him directly, and she did, without retreat, because retreating from this man had never once been a temptation. "I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice was very low. "I don't know how to have someone." He stopped, started again. 6 years. I've managed 6 years without needing anyone to be in it with me, and I was fine. I convinced myself I was fine. And then you came along and made yourself necessary." He said the word as if it surprised him, as if he had found it in his chest and not known it was there. "And now Whitmore is here, and I'm about to let you walk into a fight that I should be carrying alone. And every instinct I have says to stop you, to protect you, to send you away from all of this." Clara looked up at him. "But," she said quietly. "But," he said, and the word came out rough and honest and real. "You told me it wasn't my choice. And I think you were right. And I think if I send you away, I will spend the rest of whatever comes after this, wondering what it would have been if I'd been brave enough to let someone stand beside me for once." The barn beyond the house was quiet. The wind had died down. The world outside was cold and dark, and they were standing in the light of the kitchen stove, and everything that needed to be said was saying itself in the space between them without requiring words, which was perhaps appropriate for a man who had long since learned to speak without them. Clara reached up and touched his face, not with hesitation, not with the careful clinical quality of someone examining a wound, with the open-handed, deliberate touch of someone reaching for exactly what they meant to reach for. Her fingers rested against the scarred side of his face, against the terrain of everything that had been done to him, and everything he had survived, and she felt him go absolutely still under her hand. The stillness of something that has been braced against pain for so long it can no longer immediately distinguish pain from its opposite. "These didn't ruin you," she said softly. She meant the scars. She meant everything the scars represented. She meant the 6 years, the isolation, the walls, the weight of a story told about him by a man who had wanted his land and taken his life in the bargain. She meant all of it. "They are proof that you survived, that you kept going, that you built something real and good and solid even while people told you it was worthless." She looked at him steadily. "I see who you are, Nathaniel, not who you were told you are. Not who Whitmore needs people to believe you are, who you actually are." He said nothing. His hand came up and covered hers against his face, not pulling it away, but holding it there, holding it with the same careful, precise grip she had felt on her wrist beside that frozen creek months ago, in what now felt like an entirely different season of the world. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. The expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. When he opened them, he looked at her with something clear and certain, and decided. "Go to the minister's wife," he said. "Get the meeting organized for tomorrow morning." "I will," she said. "I'll be there," he said. "I'm done letting other people tell my story." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she put on her coat and went out into the cold night, and behind her she heard for the first time the sound of a door being opened rather than closed, and she understood that the sound was not the house door, but something larger, and that Nathaniel Caldwell had made the choice to open it himself, which was the only way a door like that could ever be made to move. She rode hard toward town, and the stars were out over Wyoming in their cold, brilliant thousands, and she thought, tomorrow everything changes. Tomorrow he stops hiding, and the truth stops being something only he knows. She thought, I will be there when it does. And somewhere behind her, in the house he had built with his hands, on the land he had fought for, with everything he had, Nathaniel Caldwell sat back down at his table and looked at the piece of paper in front of him blank, waiting, and for the first time in 6 years, he picked up a pen with the intention of writing something that was meant to be read by other eyes. It began, "My name is Nathaniel Caldwell, and I am going to tell you the truth." The church meeting was called for 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 7:30 there was not a seat left. Clara stood near the door and watched them come in, the Hartleys, the Greers, the Denneys, the minister's wife with her hands folded and her chin level, Thomas Greer's family. 2 families she recognized from her medical rounds, and 3 she didn't. And she felt something building in the room that she recognized from her years of work. The particular quality of energy that gathered when people who had been holding something in private were finally given a public space to put it down. Mabel Greer arrived early and sat in the front row, which told Clara everything she needed to know about where Mabel had landed. Old Harv Hartley came in on his bad knee without his cane, which meant he had deliberately left it behind, which meant he intended to stand for some portion of this morning and had made his peace with the pain that would cost him. Nate arrived last. He came through the door at 3 minutes past 8, and the room did what rooms do when someone unexpected walks into them. It shifted. A collective subtle reorientation, the way a field of grass shifts when the wind changes direction. People turned to look. Clara watched their faces and saw, in most of them, something she had not seen there before when Nate's name was mentioned. Not fear, not the careful blankness of people managing their discomfort. Something closer to attention, the particular attention people pay when they understand that something significant is happening and they are present for it. Nate stood at the back of the room for a moment. He was wearing his good coat. She recognized it as the one she had never seen him wear for ranch work. The one that said he had understood what this morning required and had dressed accordingly. His hat was in his hands. He was looking at the room with the expression she now knew was not coldness, but the specific, managed composure of a man who felt things very deeply and had learned to keep the surface very still. His eyes found hers across the room. She gave him a single nod. He walked to the front. What followed was not what Clara had planned, because what she had planned was careful and sequential, and what actually happened was something more organic, and therefore more powerful. She had intended to speak first to frame the morning, to give people a way into the variation that felt safe. But before she could open her mouth, Harv Hartley stood up. "I'll go first," the old man said, and his voice carried the quality of a man who had decided something and was not going to be redirected. He turned to face the room rather than the front, so he was speaking to his neighbors, not performing for anyone's benefit. "Most of you know me. I've been ranching this valley for 30 years. I know this land and I know the people on it, and I've been wrong about one of them for 6 years, and I intend to say so before Charles Whitmore has another hour to tell his version of things unchallenged." The room was very quiet. Harv talked for 4 minutes. He talked about the fence repairs, and the fair prices, and the morning 2 winters ago when his team of horses had gotten loose, and were found calmly stabled in Nate's barn, with water and feed, returned without a note or an expectation of thanks. He talked about the fact that in 30 years of ranching, the man he had found to be most reliably honest in his dealings was the one man in the county everyone had been treating as someone to avoid. When Harv sat down, Ruth Denny stood up, then the minister's wife, then a man named Cal Briggs, whom Clara had treated for a hand infection in February, who said that Nate had lent him 3 horses during the worst week of the winter without being asked and without charging anything for it, and that he'd been carrying the knowledge of that around like a debt he didn't know how to pay, and that speaking the truth this morning was the first installment. Clara watched Nate during all of this. He was standing at the front of the room, and he was very still, which she now understood was not composure, but its opposite, that the stillness was the effort of containing something that, if released, would be too large for the room. She watched his jaw work. She watched his hands tighten once on the hat brim and then deliberately loosen. She watched the moment when Mabel Greer stood up and said, in her direct, unadorned way, that she had known the stories about him were wrong for 2 years and had lacked the courage to say so, and that she intended to spend however long it took correcting that silence. At that, something moved across Nate's face that Clara felt in her own chest. A cracking open. The specific expression of a person receiving something they had stopped believing they would ever receive, and finding that the receiving of it was almost harder than the wanting had been. She moved to stand beside him. She did not touch him. She simply stood close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she felt him register her presence, the way he always registered her presence, that small, almost imperceptible settling, the exhale of a man who had been holding tension and was allowed briefly to put it down. When the last person had spoken, Clara turned to face the room. "Charles Whitmore is organizing his own meeting," she said. He has lawyers and assessors and 8 years of a carefully maintained story. What he doesn't have is the truth. And the truth, told by people who know it and are willing to say so, is something no lawyer in Cheyenne can file a motion against. She paused. I'm asking every person in this room who is willing to put their name to a written account of what they know about Nathaniel Caldwell and his land and his character to stay afterward and do so. Those accounts will go to the county seat, and they will go to the territorial governor's office, and they will be in the public record before Charles Whitmore's assessors complete their first day's work. The room did not hesitate. Chairs scraped. People moved forward. Clara turned to Nate. He was looking at her with that clear, decided expression she had seen on his face the night before in the kitchen, the one that was past the walls and past the management, and was simply him, uncovered and real, looking at her as if she were something he was no longer willing to pretend he didn't need. You did this, he said quietly. We did this, she said. They did this. You gave them something real to stand behind. I just opened the door. He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing, just absorbing. Processing the particular enormity of a morning he had not, she suspected, allowed himself to fully imagine even as he had agreed to it. I don't know how to, he stopped. You don't have to, she said. Not right now. Right now we have 30 people who want to sign their names to the truth. Let's not keep them waiting. The signed statements took 2 hours to gather. Clara organized them with the focused efficiency she applied to everything: a task at hand, people to move through it, a system to maintain. She was aware, the entire time, of Nate moving through the room beside her, not performing, not managing, but doing something she had not seen him do in the weeks she had known him. Talking to people, directly, without the walls up. Answering their questions without hedging, thanking them without deflecting, shaking hands and holding the contact rather than shortening it. She watched Harv Hartley grip his hand and say something low and private that made Nate look away briefly, jaw tight, and look back with an expression that was entirely undefended. She watched Thomas Greer put a hand on Nate's shoulder, and Nate not step back from it. She thought, something that was closed is opening. And it is happening faster than I expected, and he is handling it better than he believes he can. She also thought, Whitmore is not going to let this pass without a response. She was right about that. The response came that afternoon, and it came in a form she hadn't anticipated. Jesse rode into town to find her, hard and fast, and when he pulled up beside her horse, his face told her that whatever had happened, it had happened quickly and was not small. A man came to the ranch, Jesse said, about an hour after you left this morning. He said his name was Porter, said he was Whitmore's head man. He told me to tell Nate that Whitmore had found Garrett Cole. The name hit Clara like cold water. Cole, the man who had started the fire. The man who had disappeared 8 years ago with Whitmore's help and Nate's reputation in pieces behind him. The man whose word, if it could be produced, was the single most important piece of evidence in existence. Where is Cole, she asked. That's the thing, Jesse said. Porter said, Whitmore's bringing him in. Said Cole's willing to make a statement. He paused, and Clara could see that the next part cost him. Clara Porter said Cole's statement supports Whitmore's version. Says Nate ordered him to set the fire. Says it was intentional. Clara sat very still on her horse. Jesse, she said carefully. Where is Nate right now? That's why I rode fast, Jesse said. He heard about Cole before I could get to him. Thomas had come back from town with the news. And Nate, he stopped, looked at her directly. He saddled his horse. He rode toward town. And his face was the kind of face I haven't seen on him in 2 years. And I don't want to see again. She was already moving. She found him at the edge of town, not at the saloon where Whitmore's men were, but at the point on the main road where the decision was made, where a person either kept going or turned back. He was on his horse and not moving, and when she pulled up beside him, she saw immediately that Jesse had been right about his face. It was the face he had worn, she imagined, for the years before she arrived, closed and hard, and certain of something that was not good. The face of a man who had decided that the only available response to being betrayed again was to stop waiting for other people to act and to act himself. Don't, she said. He looked at her. You don't know what I'm going to do. I know what you're thinking about doing, she said. And I know that if you ride into that saloon and confront Whitmore in front of his lawyers and his assessors, you will hand him exactly the story he needs. You will become, in front of witnesses, the violent and unstable man He has been telling people you are for 6 years. Cole is lying, Nate said. His voice was flat and hard and very controlled, which was worse, she found, than if it had been angry. He set that fire himself on Whitmore's orders. He knows it, and Whitmore knows it, and now they're going to stand in front of this county and say I did it, and you are going to let them say it, Clara said. For now, he stared at her. Listen to me, she said, and she rode her horse close enough to his that she could put her hand on his arm, and she kept it there. Cole's testimony only works if you have no counter-testimony. 30 people signed their names this morning. 30 people who have direct personal knowledge of your character are on record at the county seat. A man who ordered his own barn burned would not spend the following 6 years quietly helping every struggling family in the valley. The jury for this, and there will be a jury, because Whitmore will push until it comes to a formal proceeding, is not going to be the men in that saloon. It is going to be the people of this territory, and they are going to have 2 stories in front of them. The one Whitmore paid for, and the one your neighbors told freely. She held his gaze. Do not give him a 3rd story. Do not give him a scene. The silence between them was taut and charged, and she could feel the effort it was costing him, the physical effort of overriding the reflex that said ride in, confront, make it direct, make it honest. Because he was a man who had always lived by the direct and honest approach. And the direct honest approach had been used against him so thoroughly that it had nearly destroyed him. And here it was rising up again because it was the only language he had that felt like truth. He's going to bring Cole into the county courthouse, Nate said. He's going to make a formal filing. I know, Clara said. And we're going to be ready for it. She tightened her hand on his arm. Nate, trust me. He looked at her. The hardness in his face did not disappear. She had not expected it to disappear. It was not that simple. But something shifted beneath it. The lever moved. What are you going to do? He said. I'm going to find out where Cole has been for 8 years, she said. Because a man doesn't disappear for 8 years without leaving traces. And the traces will tell us something. They always do. She was not certain of this. But she was certain that riding into the saloon would end everything they had built this morning. And that certainty was enough to say it with the conviction it needed. He held her gaze for another long moment. Then he turned his horse. Not toward the saloon. Back toward the ranch. She rode beside him. You could have let me go, he said after a while. It would have been simpler. For whom? She said. He was quiet. For you, he said. All of this, what you're putting yourself in the middle of. Whitmore is going to look at you and see a problem to solve. Let him look, she said. Clara Nate. She said his name the way she had learned to say it when she needed him to hear past the resistance. I told you last night that these were my choices. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Stop trying to protect me from a decision I've already made. Another silence, longer. Then, so quietly she almost missed it against the sound of the horses. What did I do, he said, to deserve someone like you? She looked at him. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the road ahead, jaw set, and she understood that the question was not rhetorical but genuine, that he was actually asking it, that after 6 years of believing the answer was nothing. He was standing at the edge of a different answer, and not sure yet how to cross into it. You were exactly who you are, she said, that's all. That was enough. She heard his breath go out, slow and controlled and real. They rode back to the ranch, in a quiet that was not empty, but full. Full of everything that had been said, and everything that didn't need to be said, and everything that was still coming, which was considerable, but which neither of them was facing alone. The development that changed everything came, not from Clara's investigation into Cole's whereabouts, but from a direction no one had anticipated. 2 days after the church meeting, a letter arrived at the Black Hollow post office addressed to Nate, with a postmark from a town in Montana Territory that neither Nate nor Clara recognized. Jesse brought it to the ranch. Nate opened it at the kitchen table with Clara beside him, and they both read it in silence. It was from Garrett Cole, not the Cole of Whitmore's saloon story. The real one, the one who had apparently been living for 8 years with the weight of what he had done, in a small Montana town where he had gone by a different name and had worked, by the letter's account, in a manner he described as attempting to outrun something that had proven unrunnable. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten, and it shook in a way that handwriting shakes when the hand holding the pen has not been steady. It said, I heard Whitmore found me. I heard he's bringing me south to testify. I want you to know before that happens that I will not say what he wants me to say. I have said enough lies about you to last more than one lifetime. What I will say, if it comes to a proceeding, is the truth. All of it, including the parts that put me in prison. I have made my peace with that." Clara read it twice. Then she looked at Nate. He was looking at the letter with an expression she had no precedent for, not triumph, not the satisfaction of vindication arrived at. Something much older and more complicated than satisfaction. Something that was cracked straight through with the specific grief of a man who was encountering, 8 years too late, the thing that might have saved him if it had arrived when it should have. "He's going to testify against Whitmore," Clara said carefully. "Yes," Nate said. His voice was very quiet. "This changes everything." "Yes." He set the letter down on the table. He put his hand flat on it, as if he needed to feel that it was real and solid and actual. "If Cole testifies truthfully, if he gives a sworn account of Whitmore's instructions, of the arrangement, of all of it, there is no case. There is no contested land claim. There is no story." "There is a story," Clara said. "It's just finally the right one." He looked up at her. "We need to get this letter to a lawyer today," she said. "Before Whitmore knows Cole has contacted you. Before he has the chance to manage Cole again." "There's a lawyer in Laramie," Nate said. "An honest one. I've had dealings with him. Can you reach him today?" "I can ride hard and be there by dark." Clara stood. "Then go. I'll stay here and know," he said. She stopped. "Come with me," he said. He said it directly, looking at her, with none of the careful qualification he normally applied to asking her for anything. "I don't want to. I'd rather you were there, when it happens." A pause. "All of it." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest was very warm and very certain. "All right," she said. "Let me get my bag." The ride to Laramie was long and cold, and they made it in near silence, but the silence had the quality of their best silences, the kind that were full rather than empty, that carried the weight of everything that had been said, and were comfortable carrying it. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Aldous Park, who received them in his office at well past the hour he normally received anyone, read Cole's letter carefully. Twice. Then he looked at them across his desk. "If this man testifies as described," he said, "Whitmore doesn't just lose the land claim. He faces criminal charges for the original fraud, potentially for the conspiracy to commit the fire." He set the letter down. "Mr. Caldwell, this letter is the most significant document in your 8-year history with this man. We need to secure Cole's safety and get his deposition taken before Whitmore knows what he's dealing with." "How soon?" Nate said. Now Aldous Park said. "As in, I'm writing the correspondence tonight and it goes out with the first rider tomorrow." Clara watched Nate's face. She watched him absorb the full weight of what was happening, the specific, disorienting feeling of being believed, officially and legally and irreversibly, after 8 years of being disbelieved. She watched him handle it with the steady control he applied to everything, and she could see beneath that control how much it cost him to hold still under the weight of it. She reached under the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand and held it, without looking at her. Aldous Park, who was a perceptive man, examined the papers in front of him with great interest for several seconds. What followed in the next week was the kind of rapid, legally complex motion that Whitmore had not anticipated because he had not anticipated Cole. He had built his case around a man he believed he controlled. And the man had turned out to have a limit 8 years of distance from Wyoming, and his own conscience had apparently located it. Cole's deposition was taken in Montana by a licensed court officer, witnessed, signed, sealed. It arrived in Black Hollow one day before Whitmore's lawyers filed their formal challenge to the land claim. And it contained everything: dates, instructions, money exchanged, the specific plan to discredit Nate and force the land sale, the fire, described in detail that only the man who said it could provide, and a statement, at the end, that Cole delivered without prompting, and that the court officer had included verbatim. "I did what I was paid to do, and I told myself the man could rebuild what I cost him. He could not rebuild it. What was taken from Nathaniel Caldwell cannot be returned. But the truth can be given back, and that is what I am doing, with what time I have left to do something worth doing." When Aldous Park read this section aloud to Nate and Clara in his office, with the winter sun coming through the window and the papers spread across the desk between them, Nate said nothing. He was looking at a point, somewhere above the lawyer's head, and Clara could see the muscles working in his jaw, and she understood that whatever he was managing in that moment was very large and very private, and that the appropriate thing was to sit beside him and let him manage it. She sat beside him, she let him manage it. After a moment he said, "Is it enough?" To defeat the land claim, Aldous Park said yes, clearly and completely. To charge Whitmore? The lawyer considered this carefully. The deposition establishes Whitmore's conspiracy. Whether the county prosecutor pursues criminal charges will depend on factors I can't fully predict. But the civil claim is gone. Your title is clean. He cannot touch your land. Nate let out a breath. Long and slow and controlled, the breath of a man who has been holding something for 8 years and is only now being told he can put it down. "All right," he said. Whitmore's legal challenge collapsed within 3 days of Cole's deposition entering the record. His lawyers from Cheyenne, presented with the deposition, advised him privately that continuing would accelerate rather than avoid criminal exposure. By the following Monday, Whitmore's men had broken camp at the Black Hollow Hotel. By Tuesday, he himself was gone. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He simply was there, and then was not, the way things leave when they have lost their leverage. Clara heard about his departure from Mabel, who delivered the information with a satisfaction she did not bother to moderate. He left before dawn, Mabel said, didn't even stop to settle his account at the hotel, which tells you everything you need to know about a man. She paused, looking at Clara with an expression that had warmth in it she had not worn in the beginning. "You did a good thing, Clara Whitfield. You and that stubborn, quiet man of yours." Clara looked at her. "He's not—" "I know what I see," Mabel said, with the unassailable confidence of a woman who had been reading situations for 60 years. "And so do you." Clara did not argue. She rode to the ranch that afternoon, and Nate was at the fence near the front of the property working, always working, and he saw her coming and he stopped. He stood and watched her ride up, and when she dismounted and came through the gate, there was a quality to his stillness that was different from all the other stillness she had catalogued in him. Not managed, not controlled, just present, fully present, in a way she had not seen from him before, without any part of himself held in reserve. "It's over," she said. "I heard," he said. "Aldous sent word this morning." She stopped in front of him. She looked at his face. The winter light was on him, and the scars were visible, and he was not covering them, was not angling away, was not doing any of the small physical, she had noticed, in the early weeks, by which he managed other people's sightlines so they didn't have to look at him directly. He was simply standing in the light and looking at her. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about this. She could see him actually thinking about it, not reaching for the managed answer. "Strange," he said finally. "Like I've been carrying a weight for so long I forgot it was there. And now it's gone and I don't. I'm not sure yet what I feel without it." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to be." He paused. "It's harder than I expected, being honest. About the things that matter." She looked at him steadily. She felt, in the specific quality of this moment, the weight of everything that had built to it every Thursday, every cup of coffee, every silence that had carried more than words, every wall that had opened 1 degree further at a time until the opening was wide enough to walk through. "Nate," she said. "I know," he said, quiet and direct before she had said the rest of it. "I know what I want to say. I've known for weeks. He stopped. "I've been afraid," he said. Not with shame. With the simple honesty of a man who had decided that honesty was the only currency left that meant anything. Afraid that saying, it would be the thing that made you leave. That as long as I didn't say it, I could. He shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not for a visit, not for a week. I want you to stay, Clara." He took I want to build something here that's worth staying for. I know it's not an easy life. I know I'm not." He stopped again. "Don't finish that sentence," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Don't tell me what you're not," she said. "I know what you are. I've known for months. I came out in the cold every week because I wanted to be here, not because you asked me to. I stayed in your kitchen through the night with Ruth Denny's daughter because there was nowhere I would rather have been. I rode to Laramie in the dark with you because you asked me to come and I did not think twice." She stepped closer to him. "That is not the behavior of a woman who needs convincing, Nathaniel Caldwell." Something that had been held in him for a very long time came loose all at once. She watched it happen. watched the last of the distance collapse, the final wall come down, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of something that was simply, finally done. He reached out and took her face in both his hands, those big scarred, careful hands, and he looked at her with the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on a human face, and she reached up and covered his hands with hers, the same way she had touched his scars in the kitchen, deliberately, without hesitation, because this was what she meant, and she had never been a woman who said less than she meant. "Stay," he said. The word was simple and direct and entirely his. "I'm already here," she said. And outside, the Wyoming winter was beginning, finally, at its edges, to think about giving way to something warmer. Spring came to Black Hollow, the way it always came to Wyoming, reluctantly, in fits and starts, the cold releasing its grip a little at a time, as if it hadn't quite decided yet whether to give up or try one more assault. But it came. The ground softened. The creek that had been frozen solid when Clara first found Nate bleeding on its banks ran clear and fast and cold, and the mountains that had been white from base to peak began to show their dark rock faces again. And the whole territory seemed to breathe out after months of holding itself against the weather. Clara noticed. All of it. She noticed it the way she had started noticing everything, with a quality of attention that was different from what she had brought to Black Hollow in November. She had arrived here as a woman who was competent and purposeful, and alone in a way she had largely stopped feeling as a lack. She had not expected any of that to change. She had not expected a great deal of what had in fact happened, and she had found, in the months since, that the unexpected was considerably better than anything she had planned. She was officially resident at the Caldwell Ranch by the time the first real spring morning arrived, not in any complicated or dramatic way, but in the gradual, practical manner of a thing that simply made sense and so was done. She kept her room at Mabel's for the sake of the territory's sense of propriety, but she was at the ranch more than she was anywhere else, and everyone in Black Hollow knew it, and after the events of the winter, no one had a word to say about it that they were willing to say where either Nate or Clara could hear. Mabel, when Clara finally told her directly, had looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been watching something develop for some time, and has been waiting for the other to catch up. "I know," she said. "I've known since January." Then she had poured them both coffee and said, "He's a good man. He needed someone who could see that. I'm glad it was you." Clara had felt the warmth of that settle in her somewhere. It was welcome. The ranch in spring was a different place than the frozen, winter-locked world she had first ridden into. It was alive with the particular busy intensity of a cattle operation entering its most demanding season, and she saw Nate in it with fresh eyes, saw the way he moved through the work, the way Jesse and Thomas Greer and two new hands moved in relation to him, the specific quality of authority he carried that was nothing like what she had heard described by the town's rumors, and everything like what she had observed from the beginning. Men worked harder for him, not because they feared him, but because he worked harder than any of them, and never asked for something he wasn't willing to do himself. And that was the kind of leadership that didn't require a voice. She watched him one morning, with the new hands, young men brothers, who had come from a struggling homestead 2 counties over, and who had arrived at the Caldwell Ranch because Harv Hartley had told their father it was the one place in the territory where they'd be treated fairly and taught properly. She watched Nate with them, and thought of Thomas Greer's first Monday morning, and the brother-in-law's wife who had come to the gate with her hands folded and her courage barely holding. She thought of all the people who had needed something and had come here, and of the man who gave without naming it. "You're doing it again," Nate said, appearing beside her. She looked up. "Doing what?" "The thing where you watch me like you're taking notes," he said. There was something in his voice that was almost dry, almost wry, the specific humor of a man who had not used humor as a social currency in a very long time and was learning again that it was available. "I'm observing," she said. "That's the same thing." "It is not," she said. "Notes implies I might forget." "I'm not going to forget." He looked at her sideways. The thing that crossed his face at that brief and unguarded and real was something she had started to collect. These moments when he was simply there, without armor, responding to something she said, with the part of himself that had existed before the walls went up. She found that the collection was growing, and that she valued each edition considerably. "The Hartley boy wants to learn to read," Nate said. Harv mentioned it yesterday. They don't have a school teacher within 20 miles. Clara looked at him. Are you telling me this because you think I should offer to teach him? I'm telling you because I thought you'd want to know, he said. What you do with the information is your own business. She considered this. I could teach several of them, she said. There are at least 4 children in this valley without proper schooling. If there were a regular day twice a week, perhaps, and a place to hold it. The ranch has a room that isn't being used, Nate said. Carefully, casually, in exactly the tone of a man who had thought about this already and was presenting it as if it had just occurred to him. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Nathaniel Caldwell, she said. Clara Whitfield, he said. Did you plan this? I mentioned the Hartley boys' situation to you, he said. The rest was your own thinking. She shook her head, but she was smiling. And he was watching her smile with the expression he wore when he was allowing himself something he had previously believed he wasn't allowed to have. She had started to recognize that expression the way she recognized weather changing by the particular quality of the air, by small signs that added up to something larger. The schoolroom was established by the second week of April. 4 children at first, then 7, then by some process of information spreading through the valley the way information in that territory always spread, rapidly and without obvious mechanism. 11. Clara taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which had been her visiting days, and which were now simply her days at the ranch, and the children came in the mornings and left by noon, and Nate, who could be found during those hours doing something productive at the far end of whatever room he was working in, managed somehow to always have coffee ready when the last child left. She did not point this out. She simply drank the coffee and felt something that she thought might be specific quality of happiness that comes not from dramatic events, but from the accumulation of ordinary mornings, done exactly right. The town's relationship with Nate had been shifting since the church meeting gradually, without ceremony, in the way things shift when the underlying reality has changed and people are updating their understanding to match it. It was not a sudden or dramatic reversal, it was smaller than that. It was Harv Hartley stopping to talk to him in the road rather than crossing to the other side. It was the minister nodding to him at the post office, with a respect that was genuine rather than cautious. It was the way conversations no longer stopped when he came into a room, but simply continued and made space for him. The way conversations made space for a person who belonged. He did not seek any of it. He went into town when he had reason to, and came back to the ranch when he was done, and he did not adjust his behavior for the changed reception. But Clara could see in small, specific ways that she watched for that it meant something to him, that it went into a place that had been empty for a long time, and was now, incrementally, being filled. The moment that broke her heart and repaired it simultaneously happened on an afternoon in May. She had come into the barn to find Nate, and found him instead in conversation with the older Hartley boy, 16 years old, a serious and capable young man who had been helping at the ranch on weekends since April. The boy was asking Nate something, and the conversation was quiet enough that she stopped at the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. She caught the end of it. "But how did you know?" the boy was saying. "When things were bad, how did you know it was going to get better?" A long silence. She could see Nate's profile, the scarred side, the side he had spent years turning away, and he was looking at the boy directly, not managing the angle of his face. "I didn't always know," Nate said. "There were years when I wasn't sure of much of anything." Another pause. "What I knew was that I had built something real. The land, the cattle, the work. Those were true, whether anyone else believed they were or not. And I held on to that." He paused again. "And then someone came along who saw it. And that helped me see it again too." The boy nodded slowly, with the specific gravity of a young person receiving information they understand is important, and are trying to store correctly. "Is that Miss Whitfield?" the boy said. Clara pressed herself very carefully against the barn wall. "Yes," Nate said simply. Without qualification, the boy nodded again. "She's good," he said, with the economical approval of a 16-year-old for whom this was high praise. "Yes," Nate said with a quality in his voice that was not economical at all. "She is." Clara walked away from the barn and stood in the yard for several minutes, doing nothing in particular while she managed her own reaction, which was considerable. Then she walked back and made enough noise on her approach that both of them had time to adjust their conversation to something about fence wire before she came through the door. She met Nate's eyes over the boy's head. He looked at her with that clear, unguarded expression, and she thought, I would stay here for the rest of my life. I would choose this every single morning, if given the choice. She thought, I am given the choice, every morning. And I do. The question of permanence had existed between them, since the afternoon he had asked her to stay. It had existed in the form of practical evidence, her presence at the ranch, the schoolroom, the coffee on Tuesdays and Thursdays rather than formal discussion, because they were both people who moved toward the true thing directly, and both somewhat disinclined toward ceremony for its own sake. But Clara knew it would need to be named eventually. She simply had not known when. It was Nate who chose the when, and she had not expected the circumstances. It was a Sunday evening in late May. The work of the week was done, and the ranch was quiet, and they were on the porch in the cool air, which had become something they did when the weather allowed. Not talking particularly, not performing the comfort they had with each other, simply being in the same place without any of it requiring explanation. She had her coat around her shoulders. He was leaning on the porch rail. The sky above the Wyoming mountains was doing what it did on clear evenings in late spring, putting on a display that no one had asked for, and everyone was grateful for. I want to ask you something, Nate said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, his profile to her, the scarred side in the evening light, without any attempt to angle it differently. She noticed this less and less now, not because the scars had changed, but because she had long since stopped seeing them as the first thing. They were part of him the way his hands were part of him. She had stopped managing her awareness of them, the same way she had stopped managing her awareness of anything that was simply there and true. Ask, she said. He turned to look at her. His expression was the most direct she had ever seen on him, which was saying something for a man who had spent the last months learning that directness, whatever it had cost him before, was the only approach that felt like honesty. Stay, he said, not the way you've been staying. Permanently. As my wife. As the person who belongs here because this is her home and not because she's visiting or because she has a reason that might eventually run out. He paused. I want you here because you want to be here and because it's yours. The same way it's mine. Clara looked at him. She thought about the frozen creek bed in November and a man who had told her not to touch him. She thought about a cup of coffee that was always ready on Tuesdays. She thought about a child asleep against a big scarred arm and a tin of nails in a boy's hands, and a letter that began, My name is Nathaniel Caldwell, and I am going to tell you the truth. She thought about all the Thursdays that had not been medical visits for much longer than she had admitted to herself, and all the silences that had carried more than words, and the specific quality of being known, truly known, clearly and completely by another person, which was something she had not had since the doctor in Philadelphia died, and which she had not expected to find again. Nate, she said. You don't have to answer right now, he said, which told her that his courage was doing its best but had limits, and she found this deeply human and completely right. Nathaniel, she said. Stop talking. He stopped. Yes, she said. Simply and without decoration and with the full weight of everything she meant by it behind it. Yes, I want to stay. I want this to be mine. I want to be yours. I have wanted that for longer than I told you, and probably longer than I told myself, and the answer is yes. He exhaled, long and slow, the exhale of a man who has been waiting for something, and has finally, after a great deal of waiting, been allowed to receive it. He crossed the porch in 2 steps, and she stood up to meet him, and he took her face in his hands the same way he had the afternoon. The winter broke, with that same careful, deliberate tenderness, and she put her hands over his. And they stayed in that for a moment that required nothing else. You're sure, he said. I was sure in February, she said. I was simply being patient with your timeline. Something broke loose in his chest. She heard it in the laugh that came out of him, real and unguarded and startled out of him by the honesty of it, and she thought, I have been waiting to hear that sound from you. I did not know how much until just now. They were married in June. At the church where the meeting had been held, which felt to Clara like exactly the right symmetry, the same room where the truth had been told publicly becoming the room where a private truth was formalized. The minister performed the ceremony with a warmth that was genuine, and the pews held more people than the winter meeting had, because the word had spread and people had wanted to come, and Clara thought, as she stood at the front of the room, that this was what it looked like when a community corrected itself, when it turned back toward the truth it had been avoiding, and it chose to be present for what grew in that truth's place. Harv Hartley sat in the front row, his bad knee extended, his face arranged in the expression of a man who is very pleased and is not going to advertise it, but also is not going to conceal it particularly. Mabel Greer had organized the reception with the ruthless efficiency she applied to everything, and the results were better than anything Clara could have arranged herself, and she had told Mabel so, and Mabel had accepted the compliment exactly as she accepted everything directly, without false modesty, with complete and comfortable ownership. Jesse wept. He did this quietly, and with great dignity in the back row, and later denied it with considerable firmness to Thomas Greer, who had also wept, and was therefore in no position to argue. When the minister asked Nate to speak his vows, Nate turned to face Clara, and what he said was not the standard language the minister had offered. He had written his own, which she had not known he was going to do, and which arrived with the force of something completely unmanaged, completely real, completely his. He said, "I spent a long time believing the worst story about myself. You came along and told me a different one. Not because you needed to fix me, or because you felt sorry for me, but because you looked at what was actually there and told the truth about what you saw. I am going to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret being the first person who looked at me and stayed." Clara said her own vows in return, and she meant every word, and she did not cry, but only because she was Clara Whitfield, who had learned in a long life of difficult work to hold the largest feelings in the steadiest container, and who understood that the feeling was not diminished by the steadiness, but honored by it. She did cry, slightly later, in private. She considered this reasonable and appropriate, and did not report it to anyone. The years that followed had the texture of a life built deliberately and well. Not without difficulty. Nothing in Wyoming Territory was without difficulty, and a cattle ranch in the late 1870s required the full application of everything two capable people could bring to it, which they brought. There were hard winters and difficult seasons, and a range fire in the third year that cost them 2 weeks of sleep, and a significant portion of the north pasture, and tested everything they had in reserves, material and otherwise. They got through it the way they got through everything together. And honestly, without pretending the difficulty wasn't difficult. Without managing each other's emotions into smaller and more convenient shapes. Clara's medical work continued. It had always been going to continue. It was not something she had taken up as a temporary occupation, and it was not something she was going to set down because her circumstances had changed. She rode her routes. She treated her patients. She ran the schoolroom on Tuesdays and Thursdays with a steadily growing roster of children and an occasional adult who appeared at the back of the room with the careful-going casualness of a person who was not going to admit to wanting something until they were already in the process of receiving it. The schoolroom expanded in the fourth year, not in its physical dimensions, but in what it held: a proper curriculum, borrowed books, a globe that Cal Briggs had brought back from a trip to Cheyenne as a gift, which 11-year-old Annie Denny studied for an entire morning with her chin in her hands and her eyes very wide. Clara watched Annie and thought about a small girl burning with fever in Nate's kitchen, held together by her mother's rigid terror and the particular gift of a man who had taken 2 frightened older children to the kitchen and answered their questions about cattle while their sister fought her way back to health. Annie was healthy. She was opinionated and curious, and had recently informed Clara that she intended to become a doctor, which Clara had received with complete seriousness and told her she would help with in any way she could, which had made Annie look at her with an expression of such intense gratitude that Clara had needed to find something to occupy her hands for a moment. Ruth Denny, hearing this exchange, had said, "She'll do it too. She doesn't let things go." "No," Clara agreed. "She reminds me of someone." Ruth had smiled, the smile of a woman who had come a long way from the terrified, barely holding person who had arrived at the Caldwell gate in a winter emergency, with everything she had left in the world riding with her. "She reminds me of you," Ruth said simply. That sat with Clara for a long time. Nate's relationship with the territory around him had continued its gradual, unforced evolution. He had not sought community. He had not changed who he was to attract it, or performed a version of himself designed to be more palatable. He had simply continued to be exactly what he had always been: steady, direct, honest in his dealings, present when it mattered, and the community had, in its own time, rearranged itself around that reality rather than the constructed one it had been handed years ago. He was asked to serve on the county land committee in the 5th year. He agreed without making a production of it. He served with the same straightforward competence he brought to everything, and the people he served alongside quickly discovered what his neighbors had discovered, that he was a man who said what he meant and did what he said, and had very little interest in either performance or politics, which made him, paradoxically, one of the most valuable people in a room where both of those things were usually in excess supply. He was not healed of everything. Clara had never thought of it that way, as a healing, as a process with a defined end point, after which he would be entirely different from the man the winter had shaped. He was who he was because of what he had survived, and the survival had cost something that was not coming back, and she thought that was not a failure of recovery, but simply the truth of how lives worked, how people were made by what happened to them, and were also more than it, simultaneously, always. What he was present. That was the change she had watched happen and that she continued to witness. He was present in his life in a way he had not been when she found him not performing distance, not managing his own feelings into smaller and safer shapes, not treating the people around him as potential threats to be kept at the appropriate range. He laughed more freely. He disagreed when he disagreed without shaping his disagreement into silence. He asked for things not easily. It was never going to be easy for him, but he asked, which was the thing he had been least capable of when she arrived. He asked her, one evening in the 7th year, whether she was happy. They were where they often were in the evenings, when the work was done at the kitchen table, or on the porch if the weather allowed, in the comfortable proximity of two people who had learned each other thoroughly and found the learning at every stage to be worth the effort. She looked at him when he asked it and saw in his face that it was a real question, not a rhetorical one, not the anxious seeking of reassurance from a person who needed to be told things were fine. He wanted to know. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. Yes, she said. And then because she was Clara and she did not believe in half-answers, completely. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. I used to think, he said, that the scars were the thing that would always be between me and anything good, that they were the wall. Not because of what they looked like I stopped caring about that, mostly somewhere along the way, but because of what they represented, what it cost to get them, what was taken along with everything else. He paused. I thought they were the proof that I was someone things happened to, that was my category. Clara was very still. She let him have the words. But they brought me here, he said. That's the thing I couldn't have told you 7 years ago, and know now with absolute certainty. Every piece of it, the fire coal, Whitmore, 6 years of the town, deciding what I was, all of it, put me in exactly the place where I was when you came riding down that creek path. He looked at her. And if any of it had been different, you might not have stopped. She looked back at him. She thought about that, about the specific arrangement of circumstances that had placed her on that road at that hour on that afternoon in November, and placed him on the creek bank needing help, and had made her the kind of person who stopped, and him the kind of person who was still there to be stopped it for. I would have stopped, she said. I stop when someone needs help. That's not circumstance. That's who I am. I know, he said. But you would have stopped, treated me, and gone on your way. You stopped and stayed. A pause. That part required everything to be exactly as it was. She considered this. She thought it was probably true. She thought a great many things that she had once assumed were misfortunes had been, in the specific arrangement of their effects, the exact conditions required to produce something she would not have given back for anything in the world. Then I'm grateful for all of it, she said. Even the parts that were terrible. Because they brought me here too. He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did now without ceremony, without the careful calculation she remembered from the early weeks. Simply reached, simply took, simply held. The way you do with something that is yours and that you are no longer afraid of losing, because you have stopped believing it will leave. The Caldwell Ranch in the years that followed became something the territory knew. Not famous, not remarkable in any public or celebrated way. Known the way a place becomes known, when it has been the source of something real and good for enough years that people stop consciously thinking about it and simply know it as solid ground. Families who needed help knew where to go. Young people who needed to learn a trade, or learn to read, or learn that the world was larger than their corner of Wyoming, knew where to find someone who would take them seriously and teach them something true. Nate, in his mid-40s, had the face and the manner of a man who had been put through a great deal, and had come out the other side of it, not unscarred but unbroken, which was not the same thing and was, Clara had always thought, considerably more interesting. He still did not seek crowds. He still preferred the direct approach to the diplomatic one when they came into conflict. He still reached for a tool when a conversation moved into territory that unsteadied him, though the territory that unsteadied him had shrunk considerably over the years. He was, to the people who knew him, exactly what he had always been, and what he had always been was very good. One evening, Clara came out to find him sitting on the porch steps with the Hartley boy, who was not a boy anymore, who was 23 years old and sitting with his elbows on his knees, with the particular posture of a young man, in the middle of a difficulty he is not sure how to navigate, and Nate beside him, in the exact quality of listening attention she had fallen in love with, the kind of person being listened to feel that what they were saying was the most important thing in the room. She watched for a moment, then she went back inside and let them have the porch. Later, when the young man had gone, and Nate had come inside and she had poured them both coffee, she asked what it had been about. His father wants him to sell the ranch and move to Cheyenne, Nate said. He doesn't want to sell, he wants to stay and build something. What did you tell him? Nate looked at his coffee cup. I told him that building something real in a place you love is worth whatever it cost you, and that the people who tell you the cost is too high usually aren't the ones who'd have to pay it. Clara looked at him. She felt the warmth of it move through her, the specific, settled warmth of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be, with exactly the person they are supposed to be with, and who knows it not as an emotion but as a fact. The way you know something that has been true for so long, it has stopped feeling fragile. Did he seem convinced? She said. He'll figure it out, Nate said. He just needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't tell him he was wrong. She nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what it did, enormous and cold and brilliant, the stars doing their indifferent, magnificent work above the mountains. She said, Do you still wish any of it had been different? He did not hesitate. No, he said. Not one piece of it. She believed him. She had learned to tell the difference between the managed answer and the true one. And this was the truest thing she had heard from him in years. And she had heard a great many true things. She put her hand on his arm. He put his hand over hers. They sat in the kitchen of the house he had built with his own hands, on the land he had held through everything, a man with money and patience, and no conscience could throw at him. In the life they had built together from the specific wreckage of what had been done to him, and the specific grace of what she had chosen to do, to stop, to stay, to see him clearly, to tell the truth about what she saw. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Because in the end, the bravest thing Nathaniel Caldwell ever did was not going into the burning barn, and it was not standing in the church hall telling the truth while 30 neighbors signed their names to his character, and it was not facing Whitmore's lawyers with Cole's letter in hand. The bravest thing he ever did was believe that he was worth loving, and the truest thing Clara Whitfield ever knew was that he had always been.